And we're live. Welcome back to season 5, episode 1 of Inside the Labyrinth Podcast. I'm super excited for today. I've been preaching this man's book for about 2 years now. Santa came early for me and for all the listeners. I'm very excited to dive into his labyrinth and his mind and really hear his journey. But before we introduce the guest, Jay wasn't able to make it with us, so I have another co-host today and part of Rush for Responders team member, Joseph. Joseph, what's going on? If you want to introduce yourself.
What's going on is I'm really glad to be here with our guest. I'm Joseph Lanzoni. I am an addiction and trauma specialist in private practice in Nyack, New York. I also am an adjunct at Fordham University Graduate School of Social Service at Lincoln Center and Westchester. And I've been a volunteer for reps from day one, and it has been a very, very wonderful journey being part of what I see as a movement to give compassion to people who very often really are just thought of as someone you call if you're in trouble. I part of reps that has impressed me the most is that we really give ourselves permission to care and give first responders permission to feel. So I'm very happy to be on the screen with Dr. Gilmartin today.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. And
you're welcome.
For all the new listeners, I am an active police officer in New York. I am also an alcoholic, but I'm more than just an alcoholic. So as you guys listen to the podcast, you guys kind of know my story and where I stand. And without further ado, I will introduce to you the man and the author of the book Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, a guide for officers and their families. Did 20 years over in Tucson, Arizona, part of the negotiations team as well. Very, very honored, as Joe said, in our Sunday night meetings, our responder talk meetings, we've read out of the book multiple times and had a full topic discussion on it. So Dr. Gilmartin, introduce you to the podcast and the show, and how are you doing today, and how your feet right now, where you are?
Well, I'm in Tucson, Arizona. Things are going real well, Frank. Thank you for providing me the chance to speak with you this morning.
Oh, of course. Thank you very much for coming on. So we're going to jump right into your labyrinth, Dr. Gilmartin, and we want to see how Dr. Gilmartin was, in kind of high school, middle school. Where'd you grow up, and how was were you a fan of high school? Did you play any sports? And how was that experience as a young Dr. Gilmartin for you?
Well, it's funny because I'm hearing these New York accents today, and it brings me back to my childhood because I'm a New York City native. I was born in the Bronx and spent the first couple of years of my life in the Bronx. And from there, we moved to the wilds of Arizona, which in those years was very different than the Arizona of today. But when I think back on high school and I think back on adolescence, I would have described myself as a fairly rebellious adolescent. I dropped out of high school, joined the Marine Corps, and I think those were shaping influences. But I was always interested in human behavior. I was interested in what made people tick. And I think that drew me into psychology and into law enforcement. And I think part of that was just the experiences I had in my own life. I'm a baby boomer. I'm an older baby boomer. And so my parents' generation were the ones that went off and fought the Second World War. And we had a pretty significant number of World War II veterans in our family. And I noticed that I didn't know why it was happening, but in my childhood, I noticed they were dying. They were dying as very young men. My uncle lived with us, was a New York City police officer, was on one of the first emergency response teams personnel, and he died at 34. And my father died at 44. And I was thinking they were healthy men, but the experiences of the wartime trauma impacted their health. Because when we think of post-traumatic stress disorder, I think we tend to think in psychological terms. And the more years that I've gone and looked at this, both in law enforcement directly and then as a psychologist, I'm really aware of the basic error that we're making in the United States in terms of providing services, psychological mental health services to first responders. We're stuck in the silo of only psychological concepts, and we have totally ignored the biological and physiological concepts dealing with mental health. Now, there are groups that are springing up around the country, but they're peer driven, and they just start because there's someone who has a vision and is motivated. And those people tend to be in their particular geographic location, and they'll start looking at, well, what happens if we get everybody in the gym? What happens if we start a CrossFit group? What happens if we start a running group here at the police department or at the fire department? And they're all discovering this independently. And the one thing that they're discovering is people's mental health improves, their socialization improves, people get better, their drive towards inappropriate behavior, towards addictions, towards family disruptions reduces. Their life works better. But this stuff was happening, and there really wasn't a science to go along with it. And if you went for mental health services, that meant you pretty much walked into a room and talked to somebody like, Kevin Gilmartin or Joe, and there was the counselor, the social worker, the clergy, all very, very, very necessary parts of dealing with trauma and dealing with the quality of life. But you very rarely went to the gym and talked to the coach. It didn't exist. Then all of a sudden, some research started popping up by scientists, empirical research, that started saying that some of it started with Duke University, where they were treating people for depression. And they put the people with depression, you're probably aware of this classic study, and they put them into three groups. One group received antidepressant medication. The second group received antidepressant medication and counseling. And the third group had 4 episodes of moderate exercise per week. In the months that followed up, all groups were treated equally successfully. So we're finding that exercise was as therapeutic for the reduction of depression as were the traditional modalities. But we're still ignoring this. We take men and women in law enforcement and the fire service also, and we get them into just great shape at the police academy. Then we cut them loose, then they go out and they deal with society's problems. And from day one, they're exposed to trauma, they're exposed to anger, they're exposed to all these emotionally charged situations that most people never have to deal with. And yet the system just ignores the biological, physiological components to that. We wait until that police officer starts having addiction problems, starts having depression issues, and tragically even has successful and attempted suicides. Then we step back, we say, geez, I wonder why this happened. And for many years, the leadership in law enforcement would step back and say, well, we have to do a better job of pre-employment psychological evaluation. Well, the realities are the field of American law enforcement does wonderful jobs of pre-employment psychological assessments. For the most part, they're putting very grounded, mentally healthy men and women into an unhealthy situation. Every day, a police officer goes into a situation that's not normal, because you don't dial 911 because something normal is taking place. So these men and women go into this elevated state. It's a biological state where they have to handle the demands of the call loads. Then we just abandon them. We do nothing to provide services or to explain what the problem is. And we're left with the situation we are in today. And that's that we have increasing suicide rates. At the same time, we're having increasing psychological services. So maybe we need to stop using a silo effect for treating, locking in our one little tunnel. And we need to broaden the tent a little bit and understand that police officers need to exercise, and they need to have it mandatory to exercise, not just for physical health, but for their decision-making and their judgment in the field. And those are essential components. A police officer cannot do their job. They cannot make the quick decisions they have to if they ignore the biology of stress.
Amen.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Because I think, so I just pulled up the bluehelp.org, doctor. I don't know if you ever heard of that website.
I've heard of it. I'm not familiar
so last year, 2019, they had 228 police suicides, right? Countrywide. And it actually, over the past few months, it's slowly been jumping up still from 2019, because I don't know if they were unreported or they were just doing a case on it. So now there's 239. And for this year of 2020, we're at 162, which is still enormous, very large. You know, it's lower than the 239 it's saying here. But unfortunately, I don't think for this year we're at a rock bottom of everyone really sitting down and going from COVID to the George Floyd protests to the election detail protests to all this stuff. And people are, I've heard, oh, that's my phone, 1 second. Okay. I've heard a lot of, you know, more alcoholic related instance on the job happening.
Well, you know, I'm an old guy and I've been around a long time, and I've seen police function in various episodes of crises, from the Vietnam War protests all the way through to today. And I'm not sure police have ever been under the stress that they are today. The levels of demand on police, the political, using police as political targets has never occurred like it has today. The whole issue of defund the police and the rhetoric that comes on puts tremendous demands on the men and women of law enforcement. Yet we're totally missing the boat. You know, when we talk about suicides, that's just the tip of the iceberg. How often do we talk about lost families? Do we talk about heart disease, diabetes, stroke, premature death syndromes? And you know, and as I think of premature death syndromes, I think of the, as I mentioned, the deaths that were in my family of World War II veterans, young men who went off and did their service and came home and never got to live their life to its capacity because of the exposure that they had in the Pacific, in North Africa, in protracted combat situations. Well, I see that same event in law enforcement. I think at a personal level, I look at the men and women I went to the police academy with, and I watched their life's journey, and that started solidifying my thinking. But in this area, but one of the things that I think is that we have to do is we have to explain to police officers what is biologically happening to them, and that's what we attempted to do in the book. We wanted police officers to understand that we have to get in front of trauma exposure. If you're a good police officer, and I can't speak for firefighters, I mean, they have the same phenomena, but I don't have any firsthand experience.
I was going to say, Dr. Gilmartin, that I've read into them that their number one causes of deaths is heart attack, cancer, and suicide, because of that hypervigilance of sleeping during the night, waking up, getting the adrenaline going, and they are almost the same life expectancy as police officers.
And the firefighter has all of the toxin exposure also, that were the inhalation and the exposure to chemicals. But as I'm studying this over the years, I've come into contact with some people that are outliers. The group, for example, in Reno, Nevada, the retired police chief and retired fire chief in Reno, Nevada, met with a medical group, and they wanted to know, why are we having heart disease in our 30-year-old police officers? And one of the things that they came up with was the exposure to elevated alertness for protracted periods of time. Now, if you think about a police officer, the first thing a police officer has to learn is how to be safe. How are you safe? Well, you're safe because you practice good officer safety. Good officer safety means you walk around with your head on a swivel. You walk around in an elevated level of alertness. You're terribly observant of your environment around you. But what's happening when that occurs is your brain is going into an elevated level of adrenal cortical stimulation. The sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system is engaged. Your reflexes are enhanced, your peripheral vision's enhanced, you're making very quick decisions because you have to stay alive. You're having to look at everything also, not just with this elevated level of alertness. You have to view the world through a filter of distrust. See, trust is not a friend of a police officer. If a police officer walks up to a car and trusts there's not a gun in the car, that's a formula for disaster. The police officer has to walk up on the car and be ready for the worst case scenario in every situation. So that means we have two very critical events taking place in our police officers' lives. Their brain is in an elevated level of alertness, and they're seeing everything through a filter of distrust. Those two events will keep the cop alive tactically, but it starts a disease process that begins killing the police officer. Because when that cop is in that elevated level of adrenal cortical alertness, the adrenaline's causing cortisol to hit the liver. The liver releases blood glucose, blood sugar. That blood glucose is the feeling of fuel that the police officer has when they're out in the field doing their job. That's that energy that they have. Well, while they're doing that, the pancreas is kicking out insulin. Insulin grabs a proportion of this blood glucose and it takes it out of the metabolic process. It holds it back in reserve and it begins infusing that glucose into the fat cells around the abdominal area. So, and it's holding that glucose there in reserve in case the stress continues. It's like when you go to work, your weapon is loaded, but you're also carrying additional rounds. You have extra magazines in case you're in a firefight and you need those resources. Well, the body does the same thing to survive. It stores fat cells with glucose in order to deal with a protracted stress. It's classic with police officers that when they get on the job, within the first couple of years, they gain weight. And everybody jokes about this as if it's something funny. Oh gosh, he's eating donuts. It isn't funny. It's a syndrome. It's the beginning of a metabolic syndrome in that police officer. It's the stress response. Glucose gets infused into the fat cell and it's ready to be used if a stress occurs. Well, that's great if stress occurs, every couple of months. But when it's every minute of every day that the officer's on duty, and it's not that the officer's exposed to danger every minute of every day, it's that the officer is exposed to potential danger every minute of every day. A cop's world is a question mark. Every event is an unknown situation. And the officer survives that unknown situation by viewing it and always deciding on the worst case scenario. The cop knocks on the door and steps to the left or the right, not because something's probably going to happen, but because something's possibly going to happen. So while the officer's on duty, they're in that elevated level of alertness. But then when they get off duty, the body homeostatically drops them into the parasympathetic state, a depressive type state. And here the officer starts becoming sedentary. The officer disengages. But at the same time, that officer's been infusing glucose into the fat cell. And this is the march that the officer is starting towards type 2 diabetes, towards stroke, towards premature death syndromes. And we can prevent those. It's so simple to prevent them by just a minimal investment in mandatory exercise for police officers. But we ignore this in the field of law enforcement. Now, what's a paradox in this field is some states that have been very progressive in terms of addressing retirement systems for police have compensated police officers as a presumptive injury for heart disease and stroke. If you have a heart attack or a stroke as a police officer in what are called heart-lung states, you don't have to show proximate cause of the heart attack. It's just you're a police officer, you had a heart attack, it's a presumptive injury. The job caused a heart attack. That's valid, that's accurate to that point. But there's still no emphasis on preventing the heart attack. And the evidence shows it's a minimal amount. The Center for Disease Control says 150 minutes a week, which is approximately 22 minutes a day. And we can reduce the major killers of police between 60 and 70%. And yet we don't do that. We have, there's Dr. Glockenspiel's office. If you have stress, you can go see him. Well, the culture of policing is such that that's a pretty courageous step for a lot of cops. That's why peer support has been so effective with cops helping cops. But it still ignores the whole benefit of exercise. If I were made king for the day, every cop would finish every shift mandatory, not it wouldn't be voluntary, because cops aren't going to want to do this. It'd be mandatory. They would debrief with their field supervisor, then they would all head into the gym and they would have 22 minutes of moderate exercise. Then they would go home. And I'm convinced if we did that, we would lower this homeostatic swing, this pendulous swing. So we would lower the depression symptoms. And if we lowered the depression symptoms, I believe we would address the suicide numbers. But we're still doing the same old that we've done for 40 years in policing, and we're not seeing the effect. And that's not in any way meant to disparage the tremendous effort, because there's lots and lots of suicides that did not occur because there's good clinicians who have brought cops back from the brink. But there's still so much more we can do with a simple, very inexpensive intervention called exercise. And the research now is just growing to such a point it can't be ignored any longer.
You said the 22 minutes a day, and it is about 20. It's either 22 to 25 minutes or 30 minutes can fight for depression up to 22% or 25%. I don't know if I read that from you or if I read that from somewhere, but that just clicked in my brain.
Well, the Center for Disease Control talks about the impact of it on the reduction of type 2 diabetes. And, and they talk about the reduction. When someone's into that field where this metabolic syndrome has occurred, we tend to wait in the United States until they're symptomatic. The physicians will use an A1C measurement, and then that means the disease is already present. The disease is, and then they write a prescription to treat the disease. Where the group in Reno has developed a blood panel for testing in police officers and firefighters, where they can predict type 2 diabetes 15 years in advance, and put the person on a remedy for treatment and prevention of the disease. And we can no longer, there's two events that go unaddressed in policing, and they are the critical signs that a police officer's life is not working. One is incremental weight gain, and the second is sleep impairment. And we know 40% of cops meet the standards of obesity. 83% of cops report inadequate sleep. It requires a minimum of 49 hours a week of sleep in order to function. That's roughly 7 hours a night. 83% of police officers report they do not receive that. Now, we can talk about this in terms of health for the police officer, but in this era where we're having the police officers become the piñatas and everybody's complaining about police. Well, if you want to retrain the police, let's bring it on. Every cop has time to exercise mandatory on duty, but we also have training in sleep management. When you look at reaction time studies of a police officer versus a civilian, and I don't mean the studies where they'll show a police scenario, a cop versus the civilian on a don't shoot scenario. And the cop always wins in those video scenarios because they're not really studying reaction time and judgment. What they're studying is knowledge of police procedures. But when you put a cop into a reaction time study that is not biased by knowledge of the police field, the police officer scores errors between 600 and 800% more frequently than the civilian does, strictly because of sleep shortage. NASA requires for astronauts that they have the capacity to sleep for 8 uninterrupted hours. That's one of the major tests for selection to go into the astronaut training programs, is the measurement, the capacity to go to sleep quickly when they have to during their sleep phase. And the reason for that, NASA says, is they cannot afford a suboptimal decision. Well, cops daily have to go into situations and make critical decisions. And tragically, some of them become suboptimal decisions. And we tend to blame the cop. We don't ever look at the system. A cop's in a bad shooting, and the first thing they want to do is look at their score on the range or look at their firearms training. Nobody ever says, let me look at how much training this cop has had in sleep management. How many hours has this police officer and their life partner undergone training at the academy on maintenance of health and wellness? We don't talk about that. We take young, physically fit men and women, and then we just destroy them biologically, and they have psychological symptoms. But we're also having reduced life expectancy. We're having astronomically high rates of diseases that we can turn back, but it takes just a minimal amount of investment, and we're not doing it. Every so often, as I mentioned, we'll have groups such as your own that take it upon themselves to self-initiate. But when you look at other movements that have changed the police wellness field, that's how critical incident stress started. A paramedic in Maryland, after the Air Florida disaster in the Potomac River, thought this is such a traumatic event. And then Jeff Mitchell pretty much started the critical incident stress management movement, which is mainstream in the United States today. Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to think at some point, mandatory physical fitness will be mainstream for first responders. It's not a luxury. You will finish your shift. It'll be part of your union contract, and you will be in the gym. Then from there, you will go back to your family. And at that point, we'll start reducing issues like lost families, domestic violence, substance abuse. I totally believe that.
If I may add to what you're saying, and not my intelligence in quotes is telling me to agree with everything you said, but certainly my experience in my field, which includes right after 9/11, I joined the Rockland County. That's where I am in New York, the Rockland County Critical Incident Team. And I had a pretty good idea from working in municipal counseling services for many years, what law enforcement personnel deal with, what fire personnel, EMS personnel, which I think very often it kind of gets lost in the background. But are dealing with very similar levels of that hyped up stress vigilance in terms of what are we going to be called to next? How many bodies or how many body parts, or like very often call to a situation where, of course, police have already been involved. There can be a hostage situation, a fight, or everybody begins to go under threat. But in terms of that, the critical incident approach, I just wanted to comment on that for a minute. To be a member, we had to be trained. A couple weekends of what was called basic training, and then going out in the field and practicing. And among the things that were confirmed for me was the overall reception of critical incident debriefing, and there was a slight difference between the three organizations that I talked about in terms of law enforcement, fire, and EMS. And certainly in law enforcement, when you get to the point with, getting past, can you tell me what happened, to let's talk about it, or would you like to talk about it? Pretty much 99% of the time, law enforcement people did not want to talk about it. Did not want to talk about it to us. Did not want to talk. My sense was that were not talking about it among themselves. What I perceived was part of the image itself coming into play, where our law enforcement personnel almost have to, in a milieu, in a system, in a fellowship, show this fearlessness. And well, yeah, it's happened a million times before. It'll happen again. It's okay. I'm okay. I don't need any help. There's a macho aspect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Having the information that you just shared, and I can't wait to watch this video a whole bunch of times so I can really take notes, because the lack of understanding and the lack of education in the general public about law enforcement personnel in the world we live in today in the United States. What I saw this summer was what I expected, but also the upfront, social response to law enforcement as not only not helping for many reasons, but also the cause of a lot of problems. And I'm not talking about what has happened in arrests or in the process of an arrest, but I'm talking about the political aspect that we live in a world today where everything is politicized. It as a therapist, it like really creates a lot of fear in me at times for what is happening and what's going to happen to younger generations that are growing up in this kind of world.
Well, I'd like to add to what you're saying, and that's we not only are things being politicalized, they're being done by spineless politicians. And I can't think of a better city to look at than your area of New York City. I mean, you would have to be blind to not have seen the major role the New York City Police Department played in making that one of the safest and most functional cities in the world.
Absolutely.
And then turning around and going in the totally opposite direction. Those attacks in New York City averaged 2,300 deaths per year. It was huge. 2,300 people per year died of homicide in New York City. And with the input of Commissioner William Bratton and the changing of the delivery services of the New York Police Department and conceptualizing issues, they reduced that to a little over 300 homicides a year.
Yes.
That was 2,000 people a year did not die of homicide. And this is in one city in the United States, and they maintained those statistics for basically 20 years. That means there were 40,000 people did not die in New York City of homicide. And yet the spineless politicians do not stand up and address that issue. And we look at the same spinelessness is occurring when we look at the whole concept of, I call it the hijacking of mental health in police. When the data is clearly there that we can preserve police officers and firefighters.
Yes.
Now, firefighters would be slightly different because there's an element of time. A police officer doesn't have the luxury of staying in the police station for the most part and just waiting there until the bell rings and going out to the call.
Definitely. Now, eating, sleeping, hanging out.
And so the police officer is a solitary profession, whereas firefighting is a group dynamic. Nobody are better team players than firefighters. Firefighters are the best team players in the world. Cops are the worst team players in the world. The cops get pissed off and take their ball and want to go home. And because in order to survive as a cop, all those attributes, Joe, that you just mentioned, macho, self-contained, fearless, those are the traits I want in a cop when you're going into a situation. You're walking into a bar with a bunch of bikers that are going to kick your ass. I don't want somebody going in there that can't hold their own, contain themselves, and look the bad guy in the eye fearlessly and put him in handcuffs. However, those are emotional traits that are specific to that context.
Yes.
Then I want that police officer.
Context.
That's right.
Context. Absolutely.
When the police officer gets off duty and drops into that depressive type state off duty that we don't
and their
address.
magic chair.
Exactly right. That's when they stop doing those other skill sets. That's when they stop being the little league coach, and they stop being the weightlifter, and they stop being the fly fisherman. You know, when you've been around a really long time, you look at some wonderful leaders that have popped into the field of law enforcement, brilliant men. And women, but in the early years, they're because of the gender bias, they're primarily men. I look at William Bratton and his brilliance in decision making for the NYPD, but I also look back at Darrell Gates at the LAPD. These are men that were revered by their agencies. The thousands of police officers at LAPD came out to a city council meeting and basically told the politicians to leave their chief alone. But this was a man who started the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, DARE program.
Yes.
But he started that DARE program not just as a drug reduction program, but in order to let his cops, you had to have 19 years on the street in order to be a DARE officer. And it was designed to show the cops that the average kid was a good kid, that the skill sets they learned on the street were not skill sets to view the world through. And when we let our cops drop into that depressive state off duty, and that I used to syndrome and that magic chair comes into place, that's when our cops stops doing all those things where they can function normally. Now you add on top of this some more biology. You know, I'm going to ask you something, Joe, because you seem to be about the same age cohort as I am. Can you remember?
I am 71. I'm a proud, youthful 71-year-old
Okay,
person.
well, we're the same age then, sir. So let me ask
I'm not too far behind.
Yeah. Now, Joe, can you tell me where you were when President Kennedy was shot?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's interesting you're referencing that because for some reason the last couple of days that's come up in my mind.
Well, now why can you remember that? That's how many, 54 years ago?
I can remember it for many reasons. First of all, I had never experienced but you know, I within myself as a young 13-year-old lived in an environment and in a culture from my ethnic family to American culture. My dad was a World War II veteran, also was in the landing of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes, liberation of Paris. And then after Berlin was liberated, he and a bunch of his fellow troops walked into what they thought was a work camp, and it was Buchenwald concentration camp. I had those stories growing up.
You had those stories, but your father had those neurochemical reactions. So for every day of his life, he could bring those memories back in full color, just like you can bring back
completely
what happened at 9/11. And that's neurology. The hippocampus kicks out different physiological responses, different neurotransmitters. Now, this is a normal response to traumatic event. I can tell you exactly where I was when I heard of 9/11. I can tell you exactly where I was when I heard of President Kennedy was shot specifically.
Oh, me too.
Specifically.
I can even remember who I was with.
But the cop can also tell you exactly where he was the first time they had a gun shoved in their face, or the first time they saw a dead body. And these are biological responses that have huge psychological consequences. Now, it's time we get in front of that and we start teaching resiliency skills to our cops, not denial. And you know, I was called one night to a multi-fatal car accident, and it was up on the Navajo Indian Reservation in northeastern Arizona. I'm sorry, the Apache Reservation, and there were several officers there, all Native American officers, And I was brought in as basically a white guy from the city to get him in to talk to these Native American officers. And I was really a fish out of water. And I got them in to do the classic debriefing. And I said, okay, what are you guys going to do about this? And everyone's very quiet, which is part of their respectful culture in terms of speaking. And one of the officers says, he goes, I'm very traditional. He goes, I'm going to go back to my village and have one of the elders do a sweat for me.
Yes.
Okay, I went to the next person. What are you going to do? And he says, I'm kind of traditional, but I was raised a Catholic. He said, I'm going to go to confession tonight with the priest. I said, okay. And I go to the next guy, and he's got on designer sunglasses, Native American cop. And he goes, I'm not real traditional. I'm not real Catholic. He goes, but I see a Gestalt therapist down in Scottsdale. I'm going to go down and see them. So even within one cultural context, there's so many different approaches to that. One of the things we did after that was we trained a bunch of peer support Native American elders to do critical incident intervention, and taught them to take the premises of their culture. Cultures have always had debriefings after trauma. Each culture does it differently. And we taught them about first responder trauma response. But when I look at this whole field right now, I think we're getting it right, except for the component of physical exercise. That's what we're totally missing. I will go to stress conferences. There'll be a couple of hundred psychologists and clinical social workers and chaplains there, but there'll not be a single physical fitness coordinator. I'll look at and review the mental health programs of police departments. And I'll say, well, we know exercise is the most effective and efficient way to treat depression, yet there's nothing in your curriculum here that mandates that for your staff. Professionally, I move between three countries: the United States, Canada, and Australia. And of those three countries, our policing procedures are pretty similar. The training is pretty similar. We because of our firearms possessions have higher rates of firearms death, but pretty much a cop in Australia and a cop in the US and Canada pretty much do the same job, except there's an entirely different response to stress in each of these countries. If you become a cop in, for example, Victoria, around Melbourne, Australia, you're going to start your job with 8 or 9 weeks vacation per year. I imagine if you started in New York, you're probably getting 2 weeks vacation per year. I'm guessing. They're starting with 9 weeks vacation.
10 days.
How many?
10 days, and it takes you 5.5 years to get to 25 days. Okay.
And so they're starting day one with 9 weeks vacation.
27 days. Sorry, that's a top 5.5 years gets you 27 days of vacation.
That's insanity. Okay, that's insanity.
Yeah,
if I am a professor at the local state college, and because all of the stress of teaching freshman psychology, after about 6 years, I'll get a sabbatical, and I could take a year to go off and study in another scholarly environment or go write a book, which is great. That professor needs to recharge his or her batteries. But after about 6 years, I'll get a break to go recharge my batteries. But I become a cop, and I can expect that I'm going to be out on the street, answering calls, working fatals, going to man with gun calls, and I'm going to do this for 30 years, and everything's going to be fine. Well, that kind of insanity has to stop. And we're going to have leaders, both in the management perspective and in collective bargaining units, that actually take this seriously. And it's no longer just lip service. It's legitimately, we don't take street survival casually. If you're a cop, you pride yourself on your street survival skills, on your officer safety skills. Well, we have to start putting the same emphasis on emotional survival skills. We can't hire these young men and women who are physically fit, idealistic, and committed, and then within 5 years have angry, cynical, depressed people who physically are in a shadow of their former self and wonder why that's happening. Well, we know why it's happening because we're unaddressing the issue. And this this will impact, just like COVID has impacted, it will impact people of color at higher rates because of the impact physiologically in terms of propensities towards certain diseases like type 2 diabetes. I was at a large city on the East Coast, police department that was predominantly African American. And they came up to me and they said, well, what you're telling us is interesting, but we all have type 2 diabetes, and our doctor says there's nothing we can do about it because it's genetics. So I said, there is a genetic component, obviously, but you know what you should do with your doctor? What? Get a new doctor. I said, roll your sleeves up. Roll your sleeves up. And they all rolled their sleeves up, and I rolled my sleeve up, and we put them into a circle. I said, whose arm is whiter? And they looked at me like I was insane. And they said, well, your arm is whiter. Of course it is. My arm's whiter because I'm the world's whitest white guy. If you're any whiter than me, you're called clear. And the reason for that is genetics, because my family comes from Ireland, where the capacity to withstand sun is not a significant issue. You don't have to because there's no sun there. But my family moved us to the Mexican border in my childhood. Now, let me tell you, Irish skin did not evolve to live on the Mexican border. So I am at an extremely high rate of premature death because of skin cancer, because of exposure to the sun. Now, I'm not going to passively just sit by and take that risk factor and say, well, it's just genetics. It's just the way it is. No, I will wear sunscreen. I will wear long sleeve shirts. I wear a big broad brimmed Western hat because I want to survive those environmental threats. Well, with our police officers, we put you into an elevated level of alertness all day long. We have to show you what's happening physiologically. We have to explain to you why trauma occurs. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. And yet we don't do any of this stuff. We passively just sit back and we wait until that police officer shows symptoms of PTSD. Then we provide them clinical intervention. Very good, legitimate clinical intervention. I'm really happy that we have that intervention there. But very, very often, what you're looking at is an officer that does not have the knowledge, the skills, or the foundation. I see the same thing happening now with all the civil unrest and the anti-police action. I'll see police officers across the United States in physical altercations, and I'm looking at a 28-year-old obese police officer who, if they had to run 20 yards and they had to sustain ground fighting for more than 30 seconds, they couldn't do it. They're not physically able to do the job. Well, that's the same issue that sleep deprivation and a half a second to make a life and death decision. They can't do that if we're ignoring the physical dimensions of policing, which we are ignoring. Right. Those physical dimensions are bringing on the psychological sequelae. And that's where we have depression, and the depression tragically leads to suicide. And trauma just accelerates it. It puts it on steroids with the trauma.
We also, from my opinion, have not yet. I mean, I hope there's a shift in consciousness about, well, a simple one. First of all, that we're all human, and secondly, in terms of specifically when we're thinking of law enforcement, there doesn't seem to be a real activated and advocated and even legislated movement to do a lot of the things that you're suggesting. I'm with you in terms of with anyone I see that is traumatized or is battling addiction, or getting in the deep water of recovery. It is mind, body, spirit. It's not just let's play antidepressant bingo. You live in a real human body, but there doesn't seem to be a solid social consciousness of being part of law enforcement in terms of advocating and helping getting all this information to law enforcement personnel and to superiors and into into the academies, so that would involve some major systemic change.
Well, it would take systemic change
to the point of where all this information is taught before, or at least the person is exposed to it before they go out.
Well, I think there are states that have implemented change, I think they've done it pragmatically. And I'll look at Nevada, and it's a long way from perfect in what's happening there. But what they established empirically was when they lose a police officer to premature retirement because of a heart disease or stroke, that costs the taxpayers of Nevada on the average $1 million. That's what taking the cop out of the game, not just with lost training, in terms of now they're probably going to medically keep that police officer alive for decades and decades to come on a full tax-free retirement. But that's about $1 million expenditure they established, the group out of Reno that I'd given reference to earlier. Well, if it costs $1 million to treat the after effects of a heart attack, what does it cost to prevent the heart attack? Which is nothing, is absolutely nothing to speak of. You just have to put the effort where it's at. I see departments right now that are spending large amounts of money on mental health programs. And I ask what their penetration rate is, meaning what percentage of your personnel at your department actually utilize the service. I'll get numbers like 3%, 5%. That's a great program. That's a great program. What about the other 94% of your personnel that didn't utilize that service? And then we hear a lot of talk about stigma. I noticed in this the stigma of seeking help, seeking help. Now there's legitimacy to that. There's no doubt about that. But one of the things that I find is that when you look at suicides, many of those officers have sought help. Many of them have tried to talk to somebody, and it's really good if the person has cultural competencies. Now we have some very, very good men and clinicians who work with the culture of policing, but we often have people sometimes outside that culture who bring in very explicit, not even implicit, but explicit biases against police. And the police officer can be compelled to go talk to that doctor or that therapist. And I'm thinking, well, we need to move in front of that, where it's absolutely the police psychologist is a part of the police team, just like the armorer is and the person in terms of fleet maintenance is. We spend more money per year maintaining our patrol vehicles than we do maintaining our police officers. And it doesn't take a lot of money, but it takes putting it in the right place. And I
agree. I totally agree.
What I always am astounded at is when this is happening, and it's happening successfully, it's not growing out of departmental decisions. It's growing out of a few people who will start a program, we'll get a podcast going on, and we'll start a CrossFit group. And we have to take that seriously. We really have to look at these issues.
Absolutely.
And the therapeutic benefits of exercise are insurmountable, just insurmountable.
I couldn't agree with you more. I believe in it enough to even do it myself.
Yeah.
I want to apologize to you. I have a 12 o'clock patient coming in. So I have to sign off, but once again, I sincerely, it's been an honor to talk.
Keep up the good work, Joseph. Okay, take care now.
You too.
All guys got to stick together.
We do. We absolutely do. And
very young.
Thanks again for creating this group, and we're going to carry on.
Amen.
Good deal.
Happy holidays.
Thank you, Joseph.
Merry Christmas.
Yes, take care.
Dr. Gilmartin, I wanted to go back to that conversation because there's a question that kept brought up in our responder talk that I run part of the program every Sunday night at 7. and we have for all first responders in the family of, and that's, I mean, I got cops from Texas, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey coming in, the family of. I run that Wednesday too. Sunday night is our topic meeting and a speaker meeting. Wednesday is like a check-in grounding meeting. And Joseph is he works that with me. I'm a recovery coach through New York State of alcohol and addiction. But our whole entire, first off, I want to go back before just talked about the program. If I was in the academy, right? If you look at the NFL, you look at the NBA, right? Their combine test and all their stuff they do, it's not a mile and a half run. It's not 20, it's not 40 sit-ups. In police world, when are you ever going to run a mile and a half? I would do something like hardcore sprints into
that's why I gave you
hardcore
a patrol car.
hardcore conditioning and all of that type of stuff, short bursts of a test instead of mile and a half. Because I'll be honest, no one likes to running. You ever heard that term, running sucks? After the academy, people are happy they never have to run again, right? It's that short burst of high intensity workouts in the academy that needs to change, where you sprint 100 yards, then you have to, maybe pretend to roll around with someone, do some kettlebell swings, something different like that to really mimic chasing a perpetrator, then the physical aspect, and then cuffing someone. Because everyone knows, even handcuffing a 16-year-old girl by yourself or a 16-year-old high school male or something is not easy. And it's not easy at all.
Well, you're talking now, Frank, about specific physical skill sets that the person has to have, and absolutely, they have to have the physical skill set of short bursts of ground fighting. And what I was referring to was the therapeutic benefit of protracted exercise for the reduction of depression and the alleviation of anxiety. Absolutely, you just like we have
but
to,
like how you said you were king for the day. That's what I was having in the academy, is to change up that course. Because when you're talking about, there's a thing also, a study called 3 10-minute walks a day. 3 10-minute walks a day at a brisk pace will help fight diabetes, cardiovascular, endorphins, serotonin, all that good stuff. And you're asking someone 3 10-minute walks a day. And the study showed that is more powerful than the 30-minute walk continuously.
And you're increasing the people's activity levels. Human beings are not meant to have adrenaline combined with sedentary lifestyle. Your adrenaline is a fuel, and that fuel needs to be utilized. And we would not have evolved through evolution if we didn't have adrenaline. We needed it to kind of avoid the predators, the saber-toothed tiger they always talk about. Fight or flight, absolutely. But you can't remain in the fight or flight syndrome for the entire day. And that's what we're asking cops to do. And we wonder why we have this depressive type response after their work day is done. It's in the bottom of that roller coaster that our cops stop talking to their life partners. They stop going to church. They stop exercising. And if we know those things, which we do know, we need to intervene in them. I have a friend who's a well-known risk manager, Gordon Graham. He does a lot of training with police around the world. And he always says, if it's predictable, it's preventable. Well, we can predict these things. We can predict that cops are going to become type 2 diabetic. We can predict that they're going to gain weight. We can predict that they're going to have sleep disorders. But we also can prevent those. But we're not.
And that's what's going to lead you to my next question is, well, so for myself and how the Rest for Responders program started is working out before. In 2018, I was major depressive disorder and alcohol use disorder. I was already a cop for 3 years, right? Before that, powerlifting, college football, working out, eating healthy. But what was I doing? I was drinking instead of talking about it. I flipped it around. Instead of drinking, now I hit 15 months sober. I've been doing the responder talk groups, checking in with people, personally going to AA meetings, but also having the responder talk on all the first responders. So I said, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a normal guy that grew up in New York. I said, if this works for me and it can work for my father, who's also a firefighter, he just hit a year sober, why can't it work for anybody else? So Reps for Responders through open gym every Saturday that I run, paying for gym memberships of first responders in New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, giving out nutrition plans, because people don't understand the nutrition part of the value of how much it can help depression, how much it can really, instead of losing weight and putting on muscle, and what it really does, what food does more than just looking good, and the fuel and what it does to your brain, and talking about your problems and getting through things and just checking in with other first responders. That's what our whole program is all about. And we have the responder talk every Wednesday and Sunday, the open gym every Sunday. We do gym membership giveaway, and they're not gym membership to Planet Fitness. They are gym membership to strength and conditioning gyms, CrossFit gyms with classes, being around other people, learning from other people, being in that group setting. And we do a workout. We've done 4 workouts already of 228 reps for the 228 police officers that lost their life to suicide in 2019. So we're able to remember those officers that this stuff, the department or whoever's department, any department out there, doesn't just make a video and all of a sudden in a week it's gone. We do the workout that's about 25 minutes, 30 minutes of partner workout. You go, I go. And then I speak, Joseph speaks, and a buddy of mine, Angel, who was in the military, he fell out of a helicopter in 2017, said he'll never be able to walk again unassisted. He's benching almost 500 pounds walking in by himself, right? So if he would have listened to the doctor, right, what would have happened? So we do all that. And the question that, the program that I started in March, the Reps for Responders, and the question we've had in a responder talk is like, what does the job, like, when is the job police? Because we got, Texas Ranger, right? A Texas Ranger in our group. We've got people in Jersey, detective, really great people. When is the job, what are they going to do to see this? You know what I mean? Because like we talked about working out, in my mind too, if I was king for the day, 30 minutes every day, instead of 4 to 12s in New York City, they end at like 23:30, 23:20, right? It's like 2300 instead of, oh man, I hope that family job doesn't come over. I hope that gun run doesn't come over. And pre-thinking that, let them end 30 minutes early, end on a good note, and then work out. Or when is the job going to have every 6 months just a talk with a clinician, instead of when you get jammed up, or you say, hey, for example, I have a drinking problem, and then it becomes a whole entire, process like that. When is that going to happen? And we talked about, and you brought it up in the conversation before, is it's a small groups like Rest for Responders and the hundreds of other small groups out there throughout the nation, until hopefully the job, and I think we've talked about, it comes down to money. But when is the job going to implement this stuff? It's not rocket science. You know what I mean?
I'm going to tell you, the job is never going to do that. And if you're waiting for management,
that's the reality, right? That's the truth.
It doesn't have to be that way. I think if there was one population that I would use my emphasis on, it would be collective bargaining units. Collective bargaining units have to look at the wellness of the brother and sister members beyond just how many dollar bills. That's important, how many dollar bills are in the pay envelope every 2 weeks. But we have to look at the bigger picture. As soon as a chief of police starts discussing issues for the benefit of police officers in today's politicalized world, instantly there's a new chief of police, because we have people. The microphone has been seized temporarily by activists. If I'm living in New York City, the last thing I want to do is defund the police, because I want to be able to walk to my hotel room without getting hit with a baseball bat. And I don't think that's such an outrageous expectation that our streets will be safe, that they'll be like they were a few years ago. And that's not going to come from chiefs, because as soon as chiefs assert themselves, they're gone. I look at what's going on out in Portland, Oregon, and it's, I don't know how many chiefs of police they have cycled through in the last 4 years in Portland, Oregon. It must be closing in a dozen. I don't know, because every time you pick up the newspaper, there's a new chief, because cops have become political pawns. And one of the things we have to look at is the stability factor tends to be the police associations. And for a long time, my bias is that their mantra was just to do political battle with management versus looking out for the benefits of their membership. When I travel to Australia, they have very, very effective collective bargaining units in Australia. The most powerful entities for law enforcement is not management in Australia, it's the unions, the associations. And they put the benefit of their officers first. And they've come up with some very innovative programs that use their leverage politically to benefit cops. And I wish the Americans would look at the Australian model, because I think our cops we would not only improve the quality of life of our police officers, would improve the quality of policing services to our communities. And it's a win-win situation. It's not a win-lose situation.
Can you say they start with 9 weeks of vacation or something like that?
Well, yes, it's
Unbelievable.
Well, one of the reasons they can do that is because in the country of Australia, which is, land mass is huge, right, but there's maybe 25 million people, but there's only like 6, possibly 7 law enforcement agencies, police departments in the whole country, because it's unlike the model we use in the United States. I live in a moderate sized city here in Tucson, and I think we have maybe 8 police departments in this one city. So in order to get in Australia, you get 6 or 8 people in a room, you can come up with the best practices in the world, and you just have to have 6 or 8 people on board, and you've changed the entire culture. I'll go to chiefs of police conferences in states like Texas, and there'll be hundreds and hundreds of chiefs of police in there. And so the cohesiveness, I think, is going to have to come from the bottom up. But even if the job isn't going to change, even if I work for the biggest idiot in the world, I can still get off work and I can take care of myself tonight.
That's the power that we have.
And that just means we have to understand the effectiveness of exercise. And I'm a real advocate for that. I'm not anti-counseling by any means. We have wonderful counseling services, but if I'm an angry, sleep-deprived, cynical cop, I'm probably not going to go see the doc. But I might get with my buddy and go in and start, getting on the treadmill or pumping some iron or riding my bike. And I think it's going to be like you say, we have to have certain skills that the job demands. The job, like you say, doesn't demand running a marathon. There's no cop on earth is going to run a marathon in part of it. If they do, unless they're in Secret Service or something. But they do have to understand that depression and anxiety can be reduced by
tenfold, by so much. It really can. And it saved my life. And I said, I never want anyone to go through what I had to go through because I made those mistakes. Let's start this program. And I'll be honest with you. I am 180 pounds. When I went through my stuff, I went from 185 to 165 because I stopped eating. Then when I went on medication, and I went to 215, I started working out hard again. I'm back to 180, mentally stronger, physically stronger. It just takes a little work to put in, but the high that you say from working out and feeling good and the energy levels, right, that it also increases. Once you work out for the day, your energy overall is going to increase, your situational awareness. I mean, I think I can hear better. My professional vision is better. You're just more alert. Like you want to get close to superhero, like a Punisher with the skull and all those cops that they put on there. This is it. This is the key to feeling like a superhero, is to work out 4 to 5 times a week, eat healthy, and go to work.
Well, when we look at going back to the clinical realm, though, if you look at the rates of morbid obesity in law enforcement, where we look at police officers who at the police academy were 175 pounds of solid muscle, now they've gained 100 pounds. And that they've gained that 100 pounds, not due to gluttony, they've gained that 100 pounds in response to stress. I always like to talk about the hibernation response. Prior to a bear entering hibernation every fall, the bear gets fat. The bear doesn't get fat because the bear is overeating. The bear gets fat because the body's dumping a huge amount of cortisol. The liver releases blood glucose. The bear grabs that blood glucose and puts it into the fat cells, and that's what the bear will eat all winter long, live off of all winter long. If a bear will do that, a bear is twice as fat at the end of October as the bear is in the beginning of October, even if the bear gets nothing to eat. Our cops get fat. They get really fat. And we joke about, like I mentioned before, about donuts. No, it's called adrenaline. Adrenaline will get you fat because getting fat is the superior biological response. The inferior biological response is staying thin. The superior biological response is getting fat. Because if our ancestors were not fat, they wouldn't have lived through the Ice Age. They wouldn't have lived through the famines, because fat people have ruled the world. Here's the problem. We have the exact same biological response our ancestors had, but we don't have a famine. We don't have an Ice Age. The reason the bear hibernates all winter isn't because they don't like hockey or they don't ski. They hibernate because there's no food in the winter. And if the bear didn't get fat, he would starve to death and die. We no longer face those seasonal challenges, but our body does the exact same response. That's why we'll have seasonal affective disorder and people will become depressed in the winter time.
Right? Yeah.
At 7 o'clock,
makes sense.
Right in December, 7 p.m. in December, people are kind of tired and they're getting ready to call it a night and they're slowing down. 7 o'clock in the summer, when it's bright and it's sunny, you're jumping on your bike and you're going for a ride. And we have to explain this physiological response that human beings are not meant to work at night. Human beings are meant to be at sea level, to have one gravitational pull, one G-force, and to stay awake during light and go to sleep in the dark. That's what they're meant to do. And cops don't get to do that. Cops are out in inclement weather, night and day, and we don't explain to them how to keep the physiology balanced.
And those midnight cops should have another course of really what happens to them when they're working midnights. That there's a sleep study that if you, let's say you sleep 8 hours, but the sleep is not the same as going to sleep on the human clock of 10 to 11 at night compared to falling asleep at 2 or 3 at night. That 8 hours of going to sleep at 10 and waking up in the morning at 7 or 8, or going to sleep at 2 in the morning and waking up at 10 is not going to be the same 8 hours of sleep. Midnight cops should have another training of really what's happening to their body when they're working midnights. And that's not out there.
Communities have to be invested in this because you're asking a police officer to make a decision in a fraction of a second in minimal light in a life and death event. And that we ignore the physiology of decision making. Sleep is one of the biggest components to decision making, and nobody makes decisions like cops have to make decisions. There'll be a court hearing, and the attorneys will argue over whether the search was legal, and they'll be doing that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after they've taken it under advisement, and the judge will take it under advisement, and the 26-year-old cop had to make the decision in half a second. And yet we don't talk about decision making, and it's the lack of leaders stepping up and having the backbone to support police. To me, I find one of the most depressing experiences of our time right now. They need to be getting championed, not thrown under the bus.
Championed on their journey. And I have a question for you. It's going to be a scenario question. I'm going to see how you would play it out. But I also want to bring up that we talked about. You look at NYPD ESU, right? The SWAT team, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, they have training consistently of you need to pass their physical fitness standards. When you're a cop and you pass the academy, all you need to do is qualify for the range twice a year. There is no more physical fitness standards at all. And why they don't implement that at least once a year or every 2 years, it kind of just is a mind blown, one day of the week. You know what I mean?
There's police departments in this country that I'll talk to police officers that haven't been to the range in 5 years.
When was the last time they stepped into the gym or picked up a weight or went for a walk?
I think they would if they knew the benefit of it and they had leadership. Right. I don't fault those cops. They're struggling to stay alive. They're struggling.
Right. And you get older, you get families, you get everything that's going on now. There's no fault at all. And like you said, people don't know. I didn't know that all this stuff about alcohol does this to the body until it was too late. You know what I mean? For me.
Well, it's clearly not too late because you've taken a bad situation, you've turned it around, and doing something beneficial with it.
Okay, so until I hit rock bottom, and this is a scenario. Thank you for correcting my verbiage. When I hit rock bottom, so let's just say you're chief of the Gilmartin Police Department. I'm Officer Frank. I don't have. I've been a great cop for 3 years. Good reports, good everything. Never got jammed up. Don't have any CCRBs. Right. Giving you a scenario here. I come to you and say, Chief Kevin, Gilmartin Police Department, Officer Frank here. I'm taking on a lot of stress. I don't have a suicidal plan, but I'm getting suicidal ideation. What should the department, or what would you do now this cop obviously needs to get help, but is he going to be punishable if he gets better? Is it a lot of cops, they don't ask for this help because they know there's a difference between if you have that situation, I believe your gun and shield be taken away because of whatever happens. But if you do get into a little let's say you get into an off-duty drinking incident and you're not an alcoholic, but it just, the one time you went out and it happened, you get your gun and shield taken away. But is there a way to let these cops know, listen, you're going to get better. You'll be okay. You get through this and you'll become a better person and you'll go back on patrol. How do you address that situation?
When I become king for the day, okay, and you're the Gilmartin Police Department, that problem would never come to my desk because it would never get past the sergeant, because the sergeant would be trained and have the expectation that that sergeant would look out for his or her men or women, that sergeant would be perceptive and would create a leadership perspective. And that sergeant would be the strategic point of entry, that sergeant would know what the services are and would reach out and say, hey, Officer Frank, you look like you're a little under the weather here. What's going on, buddy? Let's grab a cup of coffee. And it would probably never even get to the lieutenant level, because we would have it handled at the lowest possible level, and the cultures change that way. It's when organizations do that, they start pushing decision-making down the chain of command, not up the chain of command, not where we have people say, well, I'm just doing this because the boss is, no, we have leaders, and leaders, you can't have leadership unless you have ethical followership. And those are men and women who want membership in that organization. And they're proud to be a member of that organization, and they celebrate the traditions of that organization, and they go forward celebrating those traditions. And I look at the organization you're in. What a rich tradition the New York City Police Department has for how many generations of cops that are proud to be cops at NYPD, whose fathers and grandfathers were there.
I went back for a reason. I left and went back because I loved it.
And I have a significant number of my own family members that are NYPD officers. I find that same tradition in Chicago and in Boston and in San Francisco. And yet,
both of my great grandfathers were NYPD cops in the original 3-4, because before they did the split of the 3-4 and the 3-3 precincts. So yeah. Well,
and we need to celebrate that. When you look at organizations that celebrate their traditions, I'm going to be biased. I'm going to talk about the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps, they wear the same uniform today, basically, with some minor modification that they've worn for 100 plus years. There's a reason for that. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, those constables earn their uniforms at Depot at Regina, Saskatchewan. It's not just issued to them; they've earned it, and there's pride in those organizations. And I think management across the board misses that perspective. They miss celebrating the traditions. But one of the traditions we need to infuse is the taking care of our personnel and looking at the role they play in the team. And so, as you asked about what Chief Gilmartin would do, hopefully he would create a situation where the sergeants would address that issue. And if the sergeants didn't, the lieutenants would say, why didn't you address that issue? There's vicarious accountability up and down the food chain. And right now we just throw the cop under the bus.
Those sergeants would be trained in that specific, every single sergeant and lieutenant would have that own type of training module that you would create if this situation happens, not just, oh, you'll be okay, you got to get better type of deal. Or stop drinking.
Denial doesn't work. Just denial doesn't work. There was a time that in the United States, and I'm looking at this again from a very long time. There was a time when I became a young person right out of the police academy that the firearms training was so archaic. It was marksmanship training. It was, I think it was 5 rounds, six rounds in 2 minutes from 25 meters. That was firearms training. 6 rounds, 2 minutes from 25 meters, if I'm not mistaken. It was just the most insane thing that I had ever heard of. It was marksmanship. And somebody would take an average of 15 seconds per shot. And yet the realities are police shootings were occurring under 10 seconds. Right. And the time the officer engages till it's done is in a matter of seconds, not minutes. And then somewhere in the 1970s, firearms training started becoming serious. Then a tragic incident occurred out with the California Highway Patrol the Newhall incident. And that raised the awareness of we have to train as to what our job is. Then firearms training became realistic. Then officer safety training became realistic. Do you know, we've had 30 years of declining felony deaths in policing because we have taken the job seriously. Officers take officer safety very seriously. But at the same time, we have declining felony death rates. We've had increasing suicide rates because there's a cost to practicing officer safety. It's not, being a cop is not a casual experience. You know, all these people that talk about they're going to replace police officers with social workers, good luck, okay? Because all you're going to do is produce that same mindset in the social worker.
Yeah.
They did in 1968, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act pushed this. After the riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, they talked about reforming police and raising educational levels of police, and the Law Enforcement Assisted Administration was formed. You know, these are all things that have been trails that have been ridden before. We're not reinventing the wheel, but unfortunately, a lot of our leaders are reinventing the wheel because they don't know what the real problem actually is. And you have to preserve a police officer. You can have the best selection in the world, but you have to preserve that person. It's a maintenance question. And we can't keep breaking cops and hoping they make it to their 20 or 25, pull the pin and retire. When I talk to groups of cops, I'll say, you know, my goal for you is the same goal I have. My goal personally is to bankrupt the state of Arizona. I want to bankrupt them. I want to have their last penny. And I have no will. I love the state of Arizona, but they owe me because I came and I did my job and I worked and I get a police retirement check every month. And I tell the cops, I said, I want to be getting that check when I'm 115 years of age. And I'm riding my Harley over to San Diego to judge a bikini contest. I want the check in the mail because I earned it. And I want them to pay me. Now, the best investment is a police retirement because the cops are not going to take care of themselves. They're going to die prematurely of diseases that are prevented. And as soon as the cop is dead, in many states, now you're only paying what? Maybe 60, 70% of the retirement to the surviving member. And then pretty soon they're going to be dead. And so, hey, that's a great investment. The realities are I want police retirements to enhance, but I want those cops dying longer, at older ages than the average person. Because they're in better shape when we hire them.
If you Google, and I'm glad you brought that up, a lot of people don't know this, and when I tell people, they kind of get a little shook. If you Google what's the average age of a police officer, there's a study in 2013 that says 57. Then I found another one that says 66. So you think about 57 to 66, and the retirement age is 62 and a half, I think, where I'm at, 63. But why is that? That's because a lot more, majority of them aren't going to make it to 70, and they're not going to have to pay them that much longer. And I wish more people would realize that.
You see, I don't think it's conspiratorial on the government's part,
right,
but I certainly
it's
think
just how it is
naive on the cop's part. You know, I see some cop who's telling me that, oh, you know, I got 17 more years and I'm the hell out of here. Then it's KMA time, and I'm going to Florida and I'm going to play golf every day, and I'm going to Montana and I'm going to fly fish. I want you to go to Montana and fly fish, but I want you to be physically able to do that. And at the rate you're going now, son, you're not going to be physically able to do that. And we have to get you taking care of yourself.
Yeah. Right.
Got to get
we don't want you going to Florida drinking your life away after you retire, which a lot of people, like you said, the hypervigilance, the when you and Joe were talking, the post-traumatic stress and the stresses, a lot of guys and girls don't know what to do with themselves when they retire.
You know, I would teach, I have a circuit of classes that I teach around the U.S., and many academies will bring me back year after year. And one is down on the Gulf Coast of Florida. I teach at a police department, usually about 5 days a year. And I get up every morning from my hotel and I walk over to this restaurant and I sit in this restaurant and I'm eating breakfast. And inevitably at the table next to me is a bunch of retired NYPD officers. They all retired and they moved to this community in Florida. And they're anywhere from 5 to 8 of them get there every morning. And they've been there for years. And all they do is they sit and they bitch about what happened when they were on the deck. And you know, I've been there enough years that I'm sitting there and I hear the same guys every year. And I'm thinking, you know, instead of bitching about what a moron Captain Jones was in 1992, why the hell aren't you getting on your bicycle and riding on the bike trail here along the Gulf of Mexico? It's a drop dead beautiful day.
Right.
You know, and when we start looking at those things, we have to change the culture and make cops take care of themselves. And it's a partnership. We got to have the collective bargaining units doing it. We have to have leadership doing it. And we have to have the individual cop taking responsibility for their wellness. But as opposed, you know, sitting and waiting for the job to change ain't going to happen. You know, and it's kind of
you
like
can't
the Serenity Prayer.
Like waiting for that ex-boyfriend or girlfriend to come back, you know, like wait. And all that time just passes by and you're still the same.
You know, it's you talk about any addictions, they're going to use the Serenity Prayer. You know, God grant me the serenity to accept
the things I cannot change, the
I'm not
courage to
gonna
change the things we
these
can,
morons.
and the wisdom to know the difference. Yep.
The courage to change the things I can. I can get my ass into the gym tonight, and the wisdom to know the difference. And when we actually apply that as a philosophy, then we start getting change. And we've got to help show our cops how to do the toughest job there is to do, and that's we demand so much of them.
Right. No, thank you so much for bringing up that prayer. That prayer is so powerful, and I wish a lot more people would know that and then fully understand it. I say that every day.
It's important.
So, Dr. Gilmartin, I just want to say thank you so much. Before we wrap up, I got a few more personal questions to ask you to get the listeners to get to know you more about you. What is your favorite movie or two that comes to mind?
Oh God. You know, I have to tell you, I'm being raised out here in the West after coming from New York, and of my age, it's I'm an addict of the old Westerns. I really, and so many of them are filmed where I live here. So I'll watch a cowboy and Indians movie that it's an inane movie from the 1950s or something, but I recognize the mountain in the background. And I recognize, oh, there's a shopping center where that's, and so I'll watch the Western movies. And then, you know, but, and I'm trying to think of Forrest Gump, if you're going to ask me about a movie, that's probably my all-time favorite movie, just about a simple guy doing the right thing and works out right for him because he's doing the right thing. Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, Forrest Gump is great. If you had one meal to eat for the rest of your life every day, healthy or unhealthy, and you have no health benefits, like negative, what would you eat?
Well, I'm a Mexican food addict, so I'm going to be it'd be a fist fight between Mexican food and Thai food. It'd be between one of those two. You know, maybe one day Mexican food, the next day Thai food. I think those are two cultures that value it. You know.
One type of physical activity or workout you like to do every single day, and again, there's no you know, no soreness, no nothing. You can wake up every day and do it all over again. What would you pick?
I'm a runner, and I like to run marathons, and you know, I run pretty much every day, which I'm not supposed to do, you know, but I
primed your body for that. It got used to it, adapted over time.
You can, but still not probably the best exercise in the world to do. It's just, I love the feeling being done. So I have my course, and it's usually the high point of a day to get out and knock out 4, 5, 6 miles and get her done. And I enjoy doing that. Yeah.
That's like David Goggins. You know David Goggins? You ever heard of him, the retired Navy SEAL?
Oh, okay.
He wrote a book and he runs all the time. And even though he says he's not supposed to, he runs like those crazy 100-mile marathons and all that crazy stuff. And he's very hardcore.
I've run a lot of marathons, but I've never finished a marathon when I said, geez, I wish I could do a couple more miles. You know, when I cross the finish line,
that's it. Yeah.
You know, that's it.
Exactly.
So, no.
One person to hang out with, dead or alive, to spend a conversation like this with, who are you going to go with?
Oh God, one of my brothers, I think. I got some good brothers. Nice. Hitting with them, sitting chatting with them. Yeah.
If you, that's a great answer. If you had a time machine, and we first of all, when we had our other guests on, it was the past only. But then they're like, "Can we go to the future?" I'm like, "Yeah, why not?" So you come to New York, we hang out. I lift up a tarp. I say, "Dr. Gilmartin, here's a time machine, past or future. It could be 20 years ago. It could be 500 years ago. Where are you going?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to answer with two.
That's who you are right now.
I'll say two. I'd like to be able to go back to a time in Oregon when the rivers were full of salmon and steelhead, prior to the dams being built, when a fella could go out there and catch fish constantly.
Maybe find some gold or something.
No, just fishing. But the funny thing is, I say this to people whenever I talk to a New Yorker, a young New Yorker such as yourself. I tell them what they're surprised sometimes, because like I mentioned, the early years of my life were spent in the Bronx, and I lived on University Avenue, which is now called MLK, and about 100 precinct.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? That was right down the street. Yeah. And 167th, 168th, there was a farm across the street from us called the Browns Hill Farm. And you're right in the middle of the Bronx in the High Bridge community. And there was a farm. And as a little boy, I could walk across the street and see the farm animals. And I could look across the Harlem River and see the polo grounds. And I could look the other way and see Yankee Stadium. And that wasn't that long ago. That was one lifetime ago. And I'm thinking the change and the intensity of change. And, when we talk about time machines, I think I've always enjoyed history. But and like I mentioned, traditions, but I think appreciating where we've been, where we are, and then setting goals for where we're going to be. I think we have to have a vision for how we want police officers to be like. What's the service model of policing? And we don't do that just by lip service. We have to have men and women who do a tough job, and we have to stop devaluing tough men and women. Cops are tough people. That doesn't mean they have to be insensitive, and it doesn't mean they have to be brutal. But somebody has to stand up there and step between you and the person who's threatening you. And that person, in my experience, has been police officers. It hasn't been other professions. It's been, and these people who are berating the police constantly. It's often amazing to me, even now, when they find themselves into a fearful situation, they all hit 911 and want a cop come there to save them. And I think the cops collectively and their unions have to stand up and just say, look, we're doing the job. We are the one protecting you. And we're asking for some assistance back to protect the protectors.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to, go after this, go for my workout and soak it all in. And, I just really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your strengths, experience, and hope with us and your knowledge. And, thank you for everything you've done in your career and what you continue to do. That's what it's all about.
Thank you. You take care. Keep up the good work. Be safe. Okay.
All right. I got a quick question for you. So I'm just going to unrecord it and then just give me 1 second. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Have a great day and be safe.